Folks, we'll be starting, those of you that just came in, we're just letting you late guys in, and we'll be starting momentarily. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. There's Nona. Well, Nona's here now, we can go.
That's good timing, Larry. Okay, let's get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Marin Conservation League's Fire and Environment Working Group. My name is Mike Swayze. I'm the co-chair of this committee along with Larry Minikis, who will be working as a moderator. MCL is dedicated to preserving and protecting Marin's environment through careful study and advocacy. Action happens through MCL's 5 issue committees. The monthly committee meetings feature guest speakers, updates, discussion, often leading to policy development and advocacy. MCL is a volunteer-run organization and depends on member participation and support. So if you aren't a member and you like what you see here today, please consider joining us. Go to marinconservationleague.org and click on the Join Now button. We're planning to expand opportunities for members to become more involved with committee activities and outreach, including website management, newsletter editing. The Fire and Environment Working Group, also known as FUEGO, is MCL's newest committee, started in 2019, focused on promoting ecologically sound vegetation management policies and practices that support increased wildfire resilience in the built environment and in wildlands. The FUEGO brings together interested parties focused on addressing Marin's response and adaptation to wildfire. We feature guest speakers and a robust discussion. Now, as far as meeting management, most of you are now practice Zoomers. First of all, you should know we record all of our committee meetings and make presentations available for viewing on our website. Due to the large number of attendees versus our regular in-person meetings, we'll be dispensing with self-introductions. We're up to 55 and we had over 80 registrants, so we're gonna have a crowd. We have a great slate of speakers today. All are veteran in the area of natural land management. Our purpose today is to acquaint the broader community about current standard of practice for assessing and managing the environmental impacts of fuel reduction and forest restoration projects in our area. As many of you know, the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority will be funding an increased level of vegetation management related to fuels reduction, and this session should help guide practices related to MWPA's efforts. So each speaker, we have 6 of them, or 6 groups, is going to present for 15 minutes, followed by 5 minutes of questions. So presenters, I'm gonna hold you to the 15. And for questions, just for start, we'll see how it goes, but I prefer that you type your question in the chat box and let Larry read it to our presenters. I've already put the presentation, the list of presenters in the order of they're presenting in the chat box, so that's our agenda. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Lynn Osgood, Deputy Fire Marshal for Novato Fire District. And Lynn is a veteran of fire prevention work for a lot of different agencies, but probably most pertinent to this effort today, Lynn was the longtime coordinator for Fire Safe Marin back in the day when Fire Safe Marin ran a lot of on-the-ground projects. That required environmental compliance through CEQA or NEPA, depending on the funder. So, Lynn, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Marin Conservation League, for all that you do for this amazing county that we live in. I'm going to load my presentation. It should be on there. There we go. Can you all see that?
Yep.
Okay. So my presentation today is Wildfire Mitigation, a Holistic Approach. The reason for that name is it really is a holistic approach. It includes home hardening, vegetation assessment, evacuation routes, chipper days, fire-wise community, and shaded field breaks. All of my projects that I'll be presenting today incorporate those 6 components. Novato Fire's guiding principles are to protect life, protect property, and protect the environment. And the reason why these 6 components are interconnected is we can create a fuel break, but fire will still find a way to your home if you have combustibles located next to your home. This is actually a fire in Novato where the homeowners had rosemary planted with lattice behind it underneath their wooden deck. And that is why it is so important that all those components are part of each project for us. So I'm quickly going to go through some of the aspects of hardening your home. I know some of you know this very well, but some of you do not. So these are part of our wildfire mitigation specialists. Their job is educating homeowners on hardening their home and vegetation assessments. The goal is to decrease structural ignitability. We explain to residents how their house will burn in a wildfire through embers and firebrands, flame contact, and radiant heat. We explain components of a ignition-resistant home, sorry about that, which includes the roof. Gutters, you want metal gutters instead of plastic gutters because they can melt. We talk about your siding, how important it is to have fire-resistant siding and tempered windows. And of course, the venting alongside your house for embers. We explain to people the importance of modifying their fence connections because your fence can actually bring fire to your home. As you can see here, you have dry grass up against your lattice and you have a wooden fence up against your wooden structure. Here's Tom Welch's photo for the coffee park in 2017, the extension of the fire to the house. And here is a wonderful alternative to your wooden gate. Install a metal gate instead to break up that continuity. Install a fire-resistant deck. And next, the vegetation assessment. Our wildfire mitigation specialists try to educate people through hearts and minds. We are education-based and not enforcement-based. So when we go out and we do an assessment, we look at all parts of the vegetation, including more fire-prone vegetation that you see over here, which is the juniper. And we look at maintenance and spacing that's critical in a fire-safe landscape. Over here, you have wonderful different types of plants and colors, pollinators, so you can still have a beautiful garden and be fire-safe. Here's a list of some of the fire-prone plants we encourage people to remove. And we encourage them to access master gardeners in our county, which are wonderful. They have wonderful lists and will actually help with templates for people to create fire-safe gardens, which will include pollinators as well. So one of the things that we really focus on these days is 0 to 5 feet from your house and not having anything combustible within that 5 feet. That is critical. That is one of the lessons that we learned from the North Bay fires and from the Camp Fire, is not to have any combustibles within the first 5 feet. That includes bushes. It's good over here. You have some gravel, which is wonderful. This is what we don't want, is mulch right next to your house and especially under your stairs. I believe the Master Gardeners actually had an article this weekend in the IJ that was written just about this. Storing building materials under your deck. You don't want to store combustibles under your deck. You're just inviting a fire to your house. Simple things like a broom left outside, firewood under the deck, even these little areas underneath your house which litter and leaf debris can accumulate over time. You need to keep those clean. Keeping driveways and roadways clear, 10 feet on both sides, 14 feet of clearance for emergency access. Here we have a nice shaded field break on a roadway up in Sonoma County. This is in Ross Valley, of course. This is what we don't want to see. People can't get out, we can't get in. We encourage evacuation for people to prepare and sign up for notifications through Alert Marin. We encourage people to prepare today and not tomorrow, and to leave early. Don't wait until you're told. Know your evacuation routes. Novato Fires put together some maps for all of our neighborhoods in the wildland urban interface that we will be mailing out very, very soon, which explain all the different routes that people have to escape to in the event of a wildfire. We offer, each project will offer chipper days for the neighborhood, and we also encourage the neighborhoods to become fire-wise communities. That's essential in neighbors helping neighbors. And finally, the shaded fuel break, the one thing that we're all here for. So a shaded fuel break is meant to enhance mitigation efforts in the event of a wildfire situation. It reduces the fuel load. Hold on, I need to get this out of here. There we go. So Kathleen Michelle Circle project includes conducting home and vegetation assessments, providing matching grants to homeowners, promoting fire-wise communities, organizing chipper days, providing neighborhood evacuation maps, creating a shaded fuel break out to 100 feet from structures, and to provide emergency access. The reason why I chose this project is, one, it's a very small project, but two, it's incredibly important. It has a long history of wildland fires in this area dating back to 1997, where 120 acres caught on fire on Little Mountain open space that started on the western slope from transmission lines. It's like a wind tunnel there, so the winds really pick up there in the afternoons. In 2002, 3 homes were destroyed. The cause was children playing with fire in the dry grass. 2018 on Doe Fire Road, right above the area where we want to do our shaded field break, was arson. And last year, once again on Doe Fire Road, another arson. So this is the 2002 fire. You can see the vegetation, it's grasses. We have some baccharis, some fennel, some oak trees, and some eucalyptus. And of course, what we have here is the fire ladder, the wooden stairs coming all the way down to the eucalyptus debris and leaf matter and grasses, which eventually went up into the houses. Embers falling on a roof. That house did not survive either. This is the fire in 2019 on Doe Fire Road. So here's the area. It's in western Novato. This is Michelle Circle here, and this is Kathleen Drive here. So the shaded fuel break is along these houses. This is our fire department access here and up here. Some of the considerations in this project is plant communities, the acreage, the location, the noise that would be come from the fuel work, the fuel load and proximity to homes, habitat, the timing of the project, nesting season, fire season, the types of plants or weeds that are there, non-natives, and disease, any special status plants, animals, and birds that exist in that area, and the type of treatment to meet the needs of the environment of the project. Defining project goals and planning capacity. Wildfire protection would be reducing fuel intensity, reducing the rate of spread, providing access during incidents, the width of the shaded fuel break, duration of the reduced risk. Project capacity is the planning phase, which includes consultations with biological and wildlife experts and archaeological assessments. Working with the county and city. This is in Marin County Open Space District, so I work very closely with them. And the intended implementation, area, scope, and the types of equipment that will be used. For CEQA, the lead agency will determine what CEQA document is necessary depending on the results of the surveys and studies. Project magnitude, timing, and location, unique or unusual circumstances, input from other agencies or professionals, and applicable exemption classes, and type and ability to mitigate impacts. And here is a map in the blue of the shaded field break. So the project design is cut grasses to 3 inches, 100 feet from structures, limbing up the trees 6 to 8 feet, separate bushes 2 times the height, remove invasive plants, and maintain coverage and escape routes for wildlife. It's very critical. This is kind of a meadow area, and up here you have the oak woodlands where a lot of the birds nest up here and hunt in this area. The implementation would be weed whipping, cutting, chainsaws possibly, pulling broom, limbing up branches 6 to 8 feet, chipping, and removing dead and downed. And this is something I put together with our project, is the total acreage and project footprint. And these are approximations at this point. So, you know, what type of equipment, proposed location, temporary roads, what is the distance from live stream, wetlands. There is seasonal stream there that flows into a culvert. Have we addressed biological or archaeological aspects? Not at this time. I'm working with county open space with that. We are in the process of hiring environmental consultants to conduct surveys and assessments. The months that we prefer to do the treatment in this area is between August and October. And some of the constraints is nesting season, of course, and fire season. Oops, I think I went the wrong way. Okay, so here, this is a photo that I took the other day. I'll be honest, it's pretty disturbed area. It is the area where everybody lets their dogs run loose, and there is just tons of dog feces everywhere, unfortunately. So as you can see, there's a lot of backrest in there, which provides a lot of protection for wildlife. We take that into consideration. And here's the main fire road. So what we like to see is 10 feet on either side. Our best practices is to design projects and integrate as much as possible habitat functions, species needs, and fire regimen in mind. Design the project in collaboration with input from fire ecologists and wildlife biologists as early as possible and practical, which I do work closely with Sarah and Nate at Marin County Open Space. The next project that we want to put forward is Marin Highlands Shaded Fuel Break. This is also in western Novato. Approximately 35 acres is a project footprint. The actual project surface disturbance is 15 acres using grass cutters, chainsaws, chippers. Both of these will require crews to walk or hike in only to the project sites. No stream or wetlands. We have not addressed the biological, archaeological aspects yet, and we are in process of hiring a firm. Once again, work would be between August and October, taking into consideration nesting season and fire season. And the time of day that we prefer to do it is, 8 in the morning till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Project is.
You got 1 minute.
Okay, project design, cut grasses, remove dead and down, but we want to leave the mulch on the ground for the health of the soil to avoid compaction and erosion, and maintaining coverage and escape routes for wildlife. And we also leave the large diameter branches and trunks for habitat. Weed whipping, cutting, chainsaws, pulling broom. Here's one of the areas, very steep slopes, 100 feet from structures. And this is Cabro Ridge, very steep slope. Access is absolutely horrendous. It's very difficult, very dangerous. Here's some examples of that. So we definitely want to improve emergency access. Do not want to lose firefighters up there. Best management practices: avoid the introduction and spread of invasive weeds and disease, protect identified plants and animals by avoidance and fencing or flagging, conduct field work after nesting season, protect soils from erosion and compaction, provide public outreach and signage, protect streams from erosion and contamination, stop fuel work if cultural resources are discovered. Contractors and staff shall be trained in best practices. Some resources. And I knew we were living in the middle of a forest. Why wouldn't we do everything we could to make it last? This is a couple whose home survived the campfire. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Questions? Danny DeFranco asks, do you include follow-up removal of invasive weeds like French broom in your budget planning processes? Many weeds show up in following disturbances.
We don't at this time, but I think that's an absolute must. So I definitely would make that part of the plan.
Any other questions for Lynn?
Doesn't look like it.
Really?
These people are on board.
The question, timeline indicated August start. Is that still on track?
No. Actually, I'm super swamped. So since I just became deputy fire marshal, my own load has increased quite a bit. So I'm backpedaling a little bit. Hopefully maybe by September, we'll be able to start moving forward.
Mike, you want to read these or you want me to? Go ahead.
Go ahead, Larry.
Okay, so how will you choose consultants to do the assessment is from Ellie Inslee.
So we have a contract specialist here at Novato Fire District. And for this first round of projects, we are actually going to be, I believe, funding them out of our own department at that time. So we probably will go through a bid process, but I'm working with our contract specialist on that and what we need to do. I've heard from a few environmental consulting firms already that are interested in the project.
And then Woody Ellie wants to know about CEQA and the lead agency for these projects. Would it
well, you know, I think once the MWPA is up and running, they will be the lead agency to make sure that each project is in compliance. And right now, I guess that would be us. But I will also say that I personally do not have enough experience to say whether or not CEQA is required. So I would definitely fall back on the specialists.
Okay, thank you. And
to determine that.
Who was speaking? Go ahead. Oh, Thomas Irwin is asking to see an example of a shaded fuel break, but I think we'll see more of those as we go through the upcoming presentations.
Yeah, you will. You will.
Yeah, so we don't need to do that right now.
Yeah.
And that is kind of the end of questions, but go ahead, Lynn, you had something.
I was just gonna say, so a shaded fuel break in my eyes is basically mimicking a low heat ground fire coming through and thinning out the underbrush and basically regenerating the soils, because we leave everything intact for the most part and chip back into that area. So it's definitely, you know, protecting the soils, protecting the root systems, protecting the habitat, and yet just lowering the fuel load. So for our fire department and our crews to be able to get in there a little bit safer.
And Susan Stomp is speaking about pampas grass being Novato's biggest invasive and asking about flammability and the biggest source being Hamilton. And is there a plan to do something about that yet?
So I agree with Susan. I have seen pampas grass firsthand, and it takes off even in the wintertime. It is so dense and dead in there. It's definitely an issue. And Hamilton, actually most of Hamilton is not in the wildland urban interface, believe it or not. But if you go out there, the fuel load is amazing. So that actually has always been an area that I would like to concentrate on. So I am more than willing to work with her on that. I'm 100% on taking part in removing the non-natives and the invasives.
Great. And I can guarantee, knowing Susan, she will be in touch with you.
Awesome. Wonderful.
Okay, I invite Lynn to, if you can stay on a little bit, there's
Sure.
maybe other questions we missed in the chat box and you can engage.
Okay.
But we're going to move on to our next speaker. Thank you, Lynn, so much for showing up.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
All right. Next up is Mischon Martin, Chief of Natural Resources and Science, Marin County Parks. Mischon runs a big program with a lot of staff, and she has the added bonus of having, what, 3,000 homes adjacent to open space. So she's managing a lot of contact with communities. So you're going to walk us through Marin County Parks' effort in this arena. Welcome, Mischon.
Thanks, Mike. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I think I tried to quickly scan through while Lynn's presentation. I think I know of many people on here and that you're familiar with our Marin County Parks lands. I just want to start off by saying I'm going to talk about our process in terms of project assessment and project design and how we have evolved over the past several decades. We've had a lot of lessons learned. We've done some things well, we've done some things not so well, but I think we've gained a lot of lessons along the way. And I think where we are today is in a good place to continue and to be more successful as we move forward. So the two biggest guiding documents that we use are our Vegetation and Biodiversity Management Plan. This is our internal plan. It covers our 34 open space preserves, covers about 16,000 acres throughout Marin, all the way from Novato down to the tip of, southern tip of Marin. And then the CWPP, the Community Wildfire Protection Plan, which of course covers our open space preserves, but covers the rest of the county as well. And I think the main thing that I will probably just repeat a bunch of times is that some of the biggest lessons we've learned, but I've learned over the past several decades is really collaborating and building relationships on where your priorities are and being able to prioritize areas with multiple benefits. So working with fire service agencies, working with the communities, working with the other land management agencies to really try and find that intersection of those goals. So for our vegetation and biodiversity management plan and program, we have three main goals that are all intertwined. Of course, maintaining the biodiversity, the resilience of the habitats that are out there, while simultaneously, reducing the impacts of a wildfire, reducing fuels, and maintaining access, both emergency access and public access. And within our vegetation management plan, we have an entire chapter, but we have a lot of best management practices. And again, this is one of those sort of evolutions that we've had where our best management practices that we created back in this plan are things that all look familiar to most of us and things that we do that you would do as part of a CEQA process. But what we have learned is that using these best practices to inform the design, our project design, and our priorities ahead of time really, and while we're engaging with all the partners that I've mentioned, really helps when you are picking a project and you're doing the CEQA, makes it much easier because you've already done all of this work ahead of time and kind of baked it into the design. So a lot of the surveys that we do nesting bird surveys, raptor spot surveys. We have a spotted owl monitoring program, again, across all the other agencies. We now monitor for bats and do bat surveys pre and post projects. We monitor and survey for burrowing animals, of course, the rare plants and vegetation communities. We also we put restoration plans in place in areas that have sensitive species, and I'll provide an example for that. And then of course, reducing impacts to wildlife during our work, also baked into design, but also during our work. Reducing the ignition potential of the material when we're actually cutting vegetation. For any of you who have worked with us as part of our integrated pest management program, you know that we are very intentional about reducing or eliminating our use of herbicide. And I think having a lot of this work baked into the design and planning for it ahead of time and being thoughtful about where and how we are placing these projects across the landscape really helps us reduce that tool. And then of course, again, and I will keep repeating this, coordinating with not only the fire service agencies, the communities, and the other land management agencies has really helped us be more successful. reducing pests and diseases like sudden oak death, and then the big one, reducing potential for the spread of weeds, incredibly important. So the four main areas that we focus on for our priority areas are defensible space, fuel breaks, and we have a number of them that I'll talk about them. Access, again, clearing for emergency access, and then ignition prevention, which is along any roadways or thoroughfares, and then of course along our PG&E lines that run through our preserves. So this is an example. I'm just going to run through a couple of slides. I'm using Mill Valley as an example, mainly because our fire ecologist has built these slides already, and she gave this to Mill Valley last week. But I think it shows a good example, and we've been partnering with Mill Valley for a super long time, so it shows a lot of the work we're done and how, again, how that assessment and project design gets baked in. So you can see this big thick red line around, here's Mill Valley in the middle, here's Corte Madera and Larkspur at the top. And if you turn on the building footprints, I don't know how well or close to the monitor you are, but these little tiny gray dots are the structures. And then around them, these peach pink buffers are the defensible space. And this is what Lynn articulated so well in terms of working with each of these homeowners, all the local fire service agencies working with each of these homes on those defensible space. But you can see here, and we turned it in blue, it's not water, but it's just meant for your eye to be able to see a lot of the defensible space. And again, in Novato, Lynn was talking about the same thing. A lot of defensible space spills into our public lands, and our goal, and part of our goals, is how to partner with all the people involved, the neighborhoods, the homeowners associations, the fire service agencies, and how we can work together to complete the assessment on what type of projects and prioritizing. This is just an example from one of the brochures CAL FIRE, Fire Safe Marin, County Fire use. And we just use it to show, like, this is the typical defensible space. You can see the structure here. But if you live up next to open space, your required defensible space, when you're working with someone like Lynn or someone like City of Mill Valley, and you're working here up against this, that, as Mike was saying, we have over 3,000 neighbors that we are working together on how to help complete this. And how do we complete this? How do we maintain it in perpetuity? And how do we do it smartly across the landscape so that we're not, again, creating huge zones of weeds? We have mowing and now grazing programs to work with this. We have a number of different wide area fuel breaks where I'll show a picture of this in a minute, but where we start from the structure and then head all the way up to the ridge and try and accomplish a number of goals in terms of the multiple benefits. We also have a defensible space permit program where if you live adjacent to open space, you will receive a fire letter. And it really talks about, while you're doing this, creating your defensible space, hardening your home with your local jurisdictions, that if you're receiving this letter, you live next to public land. And here's how you can contact us and how we can partner to help you when you get to the piece where you're creating your defensible space. So I show this crazy map because it's a crazy map, and we use this, Mill Valley has this exact same map, but I'm just showing as an example where this is that zoomed in ridge that I was pointing out that's just north of Mill Valley. Again, here's Corte Madera in the north, Mill Valley over here in the south. And you don't have to read all the names of these crazy field breaks that we've created, but this is sort of where, just on this slide alone, we have 125 acres of fuel reduction that we partner with Mill Valley. And again, Mill Valley has been a huge partner in not only constructing these, but helping us to maintain these every year. And I show this just because I think it's a good example of sort of how we've evolved. This red line here, this squiggly red line, this is Camino Alto. It's the main thoroughfare that goes between Mill Valley and Corte Madera. And then this dashed line that you can see right here is a road up along a ridge that's above the road. And we used to mow along this, this fire road here. We used to mow along Camino Alto. And then we evolved to, again, partnering with Mill Valley to take a chunk at a time. And that's where this sort of crazy map ends up. But we took a chunk at a time where we took over 20 acres and just this one little orange. And we went in and we reduced the fuels in the understory. So we took out dead trees and shrubs. We also took out all the decadent broom that had built up in here. And over time, we've actually created a space here where we can come through with our crew and hand pull this as a wide area field break that goes from a roadside and ignition prevention zone up to the ridge. And we can maintain this every year by hand pulling it in just a few days, which is very different than having to mow something once or twice a year. This is what it looked like in the understory. You can just see it's just chock full of dead things and brush and broom. And then this is just another example of what that looks like. And then this picture sort of shows the aftermath with a clear line of where we aren't doing it on this side of the road and where we had started it back when we had started on this side of the road. You can see that this is, you know, if both sides looked like this, it would be much safer for firefighters to access through here. It also is much easier for us to maintain. It's much better for the ecosystem and the vegetation community here. So this is just an example of one of those multiple benefit projects. You can still see there's little bits of broom in here, but again, this is something we could easily go in and remove by hand. Another example is a project we partnered with Mike Lantier and the folks at Tiburon Fire and Marin County Fire and all the adjacent homeowners. And this is one that had a number of sensitive species. It was at our old St. Hilary's Preserve on our Tiburon Peninsula. And we were able to have a restoration plan in place before we began this project so that we were prepared at the post-construction phase to be able to restore this area. So here it is. This is all acacia trees that led obviously right up to these homes. We had a number of conversations, driveway conversations, end of the cul-de-sac conversations with these neighbors to talk about what we were going to do in this area, our plans, our project design, and how we were going to restore it in the future. This is part of our partnership with Marin County Fire's TAM Fire Crew. We have a 2-year partnership with them. And we actually hired a biologist, Nate Clark, who I think is on this call, if you have questions about this crew on this call. But Nate is a biologist that works, again, ahead of this crew and with this crew in terms of project design and implementation, which has been really, really helpful in terms of looking into the future before we even get there. So this is what it looks like when they cut the acacia, put it into piles, we burn the piles. This is what it looks like after when it becomes just a blank slate. And this is where the restoration plan, where we're prepared for it is of course right after the first rains. The acacia sprouts came back and we were prepared with these, it looks like I know it looks like we are just flaming dead leaves, but we did this with Tiburon Fire and when it rained. So we do this at the same time that it's raining, and we bulked up on a couple dozen of these so that we were ready. The minute it rained, our team dropped everything we were doing and went out there and just lightly go over them. You steam them. It was hugely successful in terms of really what you're trying to do is prevent those seedlings from becoming something that gets away from you. So these next couple of slides are just, again, more project designs with the TAM Fire Crew. This is up on Terra Linda Ridge, what it looks like before, and really, again, building in that project design of looking at clearing out the understory along this road. Here's another one. This is in Mill Valley again. I don't know if you can see over here, there's a home over here. You can look at this branch right here, and then this is what it looks like. So again, before, after. This huge dead tree, Jason Weber's on this call. Jason tells a funny story that when Jason and I look out on a landscape, you know, I see habitat and he sees like fuel and fire danger and this huge fire cache right next to a fire road. The fire road is right here. So if this tree maybe were out in the middle of our open space, we probably wouldn't have had the same conversation. But I think this is where it's really important in terms of building relationships and coordinating and having a lot of conversations. Is it turns out that, you know, this being right next to the road is not safe for firefighter access, obviously. And a lot of what's not safe about this tree is a lot of the smaller branches. And so in the end, after having conversations like the ones I've had with Jason for years, is that we keep the bigger logs and lay them down on the ground here while all the small stuff was able to be removed. And this is a much safer situation, and although it's a different type of habitat, it's still leaving some of this wood, bigger wood on the ground, and it's more safe. And then finally, weed management. I can give a whole presentation on this, and I won't, but just to say that in partnership with all the other agencies now, early detection and rapid response, huge wins. We've come such a long way in the past 5 years with this partnership. And I think everybody has seen an invasion curve like this, but this is just sort of to remind us all that, you know, that prevention ahead of time, if you can think about it and plan it, bake it into your design, then you're not, you're not cutting something and then over here just sort of chasing it and spending a lot of time and effort on it. Instead, you're thinking about how you can reduce that impact ahead of time. And then these are just all the tools that we use in our toolbox to do that, not only before, but during, and then of course, for years after as well.
1 minute, Mischon.
Oh, perfect. That was the end of my, I'm happy to answer questions. Also, before I take any questions, Nate Clark, I think, is on the call if you have questions about the TAM crew. And both Jim Cheka and Sarah Minnick, who is our fire ecologist, neither of them could be here, but we're happy to take any questions offline, or if you have any questions for anything about us, we're always available and happy to talk.
Great, thank you, Mischon. Questions?
Yeah, Mischon, there's only one question right now, and that's Jill Templeton, and she's just asking what you're doing to reduce SOD, sudden oak death, out there.
Yeah, hi Jill. That's a really good question. You probably are super familiar with the arc of what we've done in terms of sudden oak death, and maybe we could talk offline. We have done a lot. What we're doing now in terms of the spread between the agencies is more that we know that sudden oak death is here. And so how are we tracking and monitoring it, which is a big part of what we do.
Roger has a question, but folks, some of you are late. What we're asking you to do is to type your questions so that we can be more orderly, but go ahead, Roger, and ask your question, please.
Okay, thank you, Larry, and thank you for your presentation, Mischon. Just a quick question. Do you have any sense, Mischon, of the relative cost of fuel reduction using grazing versus hand crews?
We do. They are pretty similar, using hand crews and using goats, depending on the scale. They're pretty comparable, I would say.
Great. Okay, and then Dave Long has a very good question here. Are you keeping a record of the extent of invasive plant infestations and making periodic determinations about whether invasive have expanded or have been reduced?
Yes, great question, David. Yes, double yes. That is a bulk of what, we have an entire team that focuses almost solely on that. Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Does anyone have any questions, any additional questions? And if you haven't had time to type it, if you want to raise your hand or just show up, we have a minute or two here and you're welcome to.
This is Jack Leapster with Community Development Agency. In the coastal zone, there are areas designated as environmentally sensitive habitat areas. And the Coastal Commission has, under the Coastal Act, those areas can't be basically messed with at all. And so there's this conflict between environmental protection and vegetation management that hasn't been fully resolved. How do you deal with environmentally sensitive areas that need fuel reduction?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jack. We deal with it one project at a time. This is where I think having conversations, right, with the other agencies, the regulatory agencies, which we are in constant contact with, especially around topics just like this. It's not just in the coastal zone. We have a lot of areas that we have that are sensitive and that could be impacted by vegetation management and the work that we do. So I think it's just really, it's about having this conversation, right? Because we used to just have the like, well, which one, like, is it, do you protect this or the sensitive areas, or do you protect a community from a wildfire? And I really don't think that's the right question. I think the better question is, and where Jason and I have had years of this same conversation, which I think is great, is that, we can do it. There are ways that you can continue to protect a habitat, especially sensitive habitats, and reduce fuels it's just a matter of figuring out the path to get there.
All right, I'll be bringing you to the next meeting with the coastal staff.
Great, I look forward to it.
Okay, and let's see, Jim Casper is asking about goat versus hand crews and a multi-year view. And what he's asking is there any look at the delta cost after, or the cost delta in years 2, 3, and so forth?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a really good question, Jim. I don't have the numbers right in front of me. Sarah or Jim would, so I can loop back with you. I think it's a great question. Over time, especially again, if you're dealing with invasive weeds, which a lot of places where we have goats, we are dealing with the invasive weeds. Again, I don't have the answer, but I think it has to do with how large of an area. We have goats in really small areas, like in Larkspur at our King Mountain Preserve, over like 10 acres. And then we have them spread over 80 acres and we're moving them up in Terra Linda Sleepy Hollow. And I just think it's apples and oranges in terms of not just cost, but again, the follow-up on that. Even if you're not just using one tool like a goat or one tool as like a hand crew, we're usually using multiple tools.
Right, and then let's see, Christy Neal made a comment here about this may be to an earlier comment about the TAM fire crew runs approximately 8,000 a day and they are using different tools and doing different work. That's just a comment you make. There wasn't really a question there. Woody Elliott is asking, are you following up on maintenance plans and funding in place?
Yes, we are following up. So that is one of the most important pieces of how we think about our budget moving forward, right? Like that was kind of one of the reasons why I showed that crazy map. That was just in Mill Valley. And if you think about placement across the landscape of where we place and project assessment and design and all the environmental review that goes into that, but then at the end of that, you have to maintain all of that. And what does that look like? And again, it depends. If there's weeds involved, you may have to maintain that multiple times a year, which is not super cost effective. But if you can do it in a way that you don't have weeds or you can prevent the weeds or reduce the weeds up front, it's a much simpler, less costly job to maintain it.
Mischon, thank you very much. We're going to move on to our next speaker. Really appreciate you coming and spending time with us. Great program, great presentation. You get the pace of this now because 20 minutes goes by just like that. And we want to get to dinner eventually. So next up is Carl Sanders. Carl's the Natural Resource Program Manager at Marin Municipal Water District. Carl's going to talk about their vegetation management plan and their implementation efforts. Thank you, Carl.
Carl, are you unmuted?
Carl.
I'm here, I'm back.
Okay, there you are.
There we are. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'll just start with an outline of what I intend to talk about this afternoon. And that is our recently adopted Biodiversity, Fire, and Fuels Integrated Plan. I'll talk about the threats and trends that influence the plan, our plan goals, the strategies that we have within those goals. I'll also outline work that we completed this last fiscal year ending June 2020. Show you a map of that. We'll talk about our ongoing monitoring that influences the work, especially for project assessment looking forward. And for this group, I'll be talking briefly also about project design, our environmental compliance, and then some brief project overviews showing various techniques for implementation. And I'll end with our best management practices, which are common to many of our agencies. Again, the Biodiversity Fire and Fuels Integrated Plan is a programmatic plan that covers CEQA for the MMWD. It is, or was, 10 plus years in the making. Mike was a big part of that. It was formally adopted fall of last year. We've been moving forward with it. So this is our first year of implementation, and yeah, again, programmatic that allows us to work at a much broader extent than we ever had before. From our legal department, I had to include this, but I was asked that we're not part of the MWPA, the projects aren't part of the MWPA, and that we conduct our work independently on the land with our own contractors and consultants to implement the work. Thank you, legal. All right, so what influenced our plan? This is common again to all of us here in Marin County. Most of us on the West Coast and maybe even the West as a whole. But the multifaceted, integrated, overlapping world of wildland fire, invasive weeds, forest diseases, and climate change, and the interrelationship between all of those, and how we manage our lands, and specifically how we manage our watershed within this context. The diagram off to the right, 2 diagrams off to the right, just as an example, shows sod impacted or sudden oak death impacted lands back in 2004, and 10 years later. It's increasing. What maybe I've noted as well is that in the upper diagram, the soft yellow color are those areas that are susceptible to sod. If you look, pretty much everything that was susceptible in 2004 has succumbed in 2014 to sod. Again, sudden oak death. 3 primary goals of the BIFIP that overarch all of our decision making. Goal 1 is to minimize the risks of wildfire in terms of our fuel breaks, in terms of maintaining them and creating them. Forestry work for forest resilience, our invasives or weed management, looking at reducing sources of ignition, as Mischon was saying, working with other agencies in a cooperative approach. Goal 2, to preserve and enhance our existing biological resources. We do quite a bit of inventorying, mapping, and monitoring. And we're putting in place plans for restoration of various habitat and other ecosystem functions. Final goal is an adaptive framework that allows us to learn from what we've been doing and how we may change in the future. So we just finished an annual report that'll be presented to our board next week, and that'll be then open to the public, and that'll discuss, I'll give you a brief overview of that, but that'll discuss what we completed and how much it cost, as well as the compliance part of it, but also gives us the opportunity to experiment with new techniques as they may come open. Just a quick side by side, our 1995 EDGE plan is what we worked off of for many a year, comparing the scope of that with the red and the blue there to our current plan, the BIFIP, which breaks our landscape into zones, into which we break it further into management actions. As you can see, it covers quite a bit of our land into varying zones that help define what we're going to do. Deferred action, I'll just briefly go over them. Deferred action is an area that we're not currently going to treat. Fuel break maintenance are existing fuel breaks that we will continue to maintain. There's a small amount of new fuel break work that we conduct every year. I think the color of that here is hard to see, but it's a small part of what we do. I want to show you another slide. So as I mentioned, we break the landscape up into zones, and those zones have various targets and treatments. Those are broken up into 2 primary types of strategies. That's a fuel break in a natural area. Fuel breaks, we break up again into those that are optimized that currently have no weeds, and we want to emphasize or really prioritize keeping weeds out of them. Transitional are those that have manageable or few amounts of weeds. That's mostly French broom and occasionally yellow star thistle. And we have those areas that are compromised, that have persistent weeds that are difficult to control. Natural areas, the second type of strategy, are those that are preservation zones. Stressors are minimal. They may not have all weed influences or encroachment of other natives. Restoration zones are areas that we want to put effort into trying to retain natural habitat function where the stressors are moderate, that is maybe weeds. And deferred action where the stressors are high, where they're so overgrown with weeds that at this time we're not going to, we don't have the capacity to address them. So the maps down below show areas around Bontempi Lake and the different zones and strategies. Okay, quick brief overview of work that we conducted this last fiscal year. And this again would be from July 2019 to June 2020. The colors up on the right hand are helpful in terms of looking at the management actions within each zone. Forest health is an area that we're looking at thinning and maintaining or creating forest resiliency. I'll give you examples of that. Grassland and oak woodland health are areas that we often are, again, removing invasives. Oftentimes it's Douglas fir, a native conifer that invades grasslands and oak woodland habitat in the absence of fire. The fuel break system that we have currently in place, kind of a peanut butter color that runs around the perimeter of our property here, through this, and then around Phoenix Lake here, around the perimeter near Fairfax. We're maintaining that, and the kind of mustard yellow color here is an area that we're widening or expanding our fuel breaks. And we only did a little bit of that this year, about 4 acres down in Mill Valley, probably hard to see, but in the railroad grade area above Fern Canyon. Importantly, we do a lot of coordinated work with our leaseholders, many of whom are on top of Mount Tam. You've probably all seen the golf ball up there by the FAA, as well as all of the other microwave and cellular towers that are up on top of Tam. Most of that land is leased by MMWD, and so we work with those property managers to create defensible space there. And importantly, we work with PG&E on the distribution line. This is the transmission line, the Bolinas-Nicasio transmission line, and then the various distribution lines that come off of that on Mount Tam, working with PG&E on fuel reduction below those lines, as well as maintaining the actual infrastructure, poles and hardware. So just a quick example of some monitoring. This is existing monitoring that's ongoing that helps us inform our work for rare plants, seeps and springs, weeds, primarily French broom, but also with that is yellow and purple star thistle. Hydrology, we're starting to increase our monitoring of the impacts of our work on local hydrology. I'll give an example of that. Ongoing is continued landscape vegetation mapping, looking at our plant communities, looking at the change of those communities over time. For encroachment into grasslands, as well as moving forward, looking at forest pests and pathogens. So as we design or look forward, or as we look forward in our project planning efforts, these are the types of considerations that we take into account as we prioritize and assess projects. Looking at risk, facilities at risk, or water infrastructure, as mentioned before, emergency access and egress, ignition potential, especially under our power lines. As we look at our fuel breaks and defensible space, we're thinking about fire behavior and topography. As we look at projects, we're also taking into account the type of plant communities that we're working within, grasslands, chaparral, woodland, and forest, for example. And the fuel load and type. So within each of those plant communities, we may have an understory that is full of decadent and dead material, such as sod or shaded chaparral. We're also looking at ladder and canopy fuels. The resource objectives that inform all of that are forest health, ecosystem function, habitat values, proximity to weeds and disease, and of course the feasibility in terms of the cost benefit, and is the site accessible. Most of Mount Tamalpais watershed is difficult to access due to the steep slopes. Additional considerations as we're putting projects together, as I mentioned before, the type of treatment is going to be defined in part by the plant community that we're within, whether it be an oak or hardwood woodland or a mixed conifer forest versus shrub or grasslands. Proximity to assets at risk. There was mention earlier by Mischon of defensible space, and where that overlaps our land, we take that into account. Proximity to urban areas or the wild and urban interface. I talked about fuels, weeds and disease. As we design projects, we don't want to increase infestations of brooms, tar thistle, and sod. So we're looking at VMPs to minimize the spread and or minimize the spread. Of course, we have to take into account special status species, such as northern spotted owls, foothill yellow-legged frogs, and rare plants. Habitat, such as wetlands, influences our project design in terms of access and where we conduct our treatments. Mentioned before, timing in terms of nesting season, and soils. Soils, we don't want to work on the certain forest types or off-road with heavy equipment if soils are saturated due to rainy conditions. I'll give some examples also coming up of the different types of treatment, whether it be a machine mastication or a hand crew, chipping and broadcasting, lopping and scattering, and pile burning. Budget, of course, estimating and contracting is always important.
Carl, 2 minutes.
Money to do the work. Ongoing surveys, and most of these are occurring, throughout the year and in advance of the projects. And nesting birds, anywhere from January upwards into September. Northern spotted owls, we have continuous data for over 10, 15 years, so we know areas to avoid for their habitat. Same thing with rare plants. We have a really good database in terms of threatened, endangered, and locally rare plants for avoidance during project design. Our lakes, some of them are full of native western pond turtles, a species of special concern, not threatened or endangered at this point. Also, we conduct surveys for foothill yellow-legged frogs, red-legged frogs, and we're starting to put more interest into the Pacific giant salamanders. And of course, anadromous fish, the coho and steelhead salmon, lower reaches of Lagunitas Creek, we have to take into account if we're doing or conducting any work in those areas. Like open space, bats and burrowing animals such as badgers are becoming more a part of our survey and compliance process. I also mentioned the types of habitat that we take into account too as we're designing projects. I didn't mention before, but serpentine soils is another one.
Carl, you're down to your last minute.
Oh my goodness, I'm talking too much. Here we go, on the ground action. It's done with hand crews and machines, as you can see here in these pictures. It's done with various hand crews from around the state, from state CCCs, local CCNB, county fire, TAM fire. Examples of different types of work we conduct. Defensible space around our leased facilities, Middle Peak. Forest thinning, this is conducted this last summer around Potrero Meadow. Forest health, reducing sudden oak death primarily and fir encroachment into the woodlands. Examples of fuel breaks. Somebody was asking what a shaded fuel break looks like. These are 2 examples of shaded fuel breaks. One Marin at Deer Park in Fairfax, another one up by Sky Oaks near Knob 2. Best management practices. So these are actually hardwired into our plan, but these are all things that we're taking into account to limit impacts to air, soil, weeds, water quality, avoidance. That's probably the top one, is if you can avoid it through fencing, flagging, or timing in terms of resource impacts. Training, we mentioned, that's been mentioned before, but yeah, making sure the staff and contractors are all trained in the BMPs and the treatments at hand. And then, of course, ongoing long-term monitoring of ecosystem health after we've conducted the work, especially looking at invasive species to make sure that they are not moving into areas that we've recently treated. There we go. I had to speed that last part up.
Good finish.
Abracadabra.
Thank you, Carl. And so Nona has a question for you, Carl. Would you please explain the areas of deferred action? Are these areas of broom that your budget doesn't permit working on? And how and when will you address the fuel needs in these areas?
A good example of deferred action would be some of the broom infested areas above Deer Park, above the town of Fairfax, where the Deer Park, where the broom is has so invaded and so taken over that oak woodland that we don't have the capacity or technique or funding to address those areas. The understory is nearly 100% French broom cover. I hope that answers that question. It doesn't mean that it's off the table completely, but it's not within our current capacity to or priority to address at this point.
How about finding volunteers to get out there and do this kind of work? There's a lot of people that, myself included, that love to pull broom.
We, during the COVID restrictions, we're struggling to figure out how to keep our volunteers out there, busy and productive. But rest assured, we'll have more broom for you, Larry.
Well, there's plenty.
Plenty to pull.
Plenty to pull. And then Bill Carney has, Carl, why is fire encroachment into grasslands, that's a quote, viewed as a problem rather than as natural plant cession?
Good question.
Fur encroachment, not fire.
Oh, fur. Sorry.
Yes. So on the North Coast, in the Bay Area, Douglas fir, native conifer, does really well. It's a fast-growing native species that, in the absence of fire, tends to encroach and grow into habitats such as grasslands and oak woodlands. And in a naturally occur, or let's say pre-European fire regime where you'd had lower intensity, higher frequency fires, that fir encroachment would have probably been kept in check. But now we're losing a significant amount of our grassland habitat, and our oak habitat is being compromised due to this fir encroachment. So we're trying to maintain the landscape biodiversity by removing Douglas fir.
Great, really clear presentation, Carl. Does anyone else have any more questions at this point? I think you did a great job. Only a couple of questions there for you. Mike, you want to pick it up?
Thank you, Carl. Thanks for attending and doing a presentation for us. Really appreciate it. Next up is Cyndy Shafer. Cyndy's the Natural Resource Program Manager for California State Parks. She manages about 30,000 acres in the Northern Bay Area, and another experienced hand. Cyndy's going to talk about state park programs in this area.
Great.
Thank you, Cyndy.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, so as Mike mentioned, I manage the Natural Resource Program for the Bay Area District, which covers about 30,000 acres in Marin, Sonoma, and Napa counties, and then down to Candlestick Point in San Francisco. And it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, well, virtually, with the group, because I work with a lot of the partners that have already presented, and you're going to see a lot of similarities in what State Parks does, and also some differences. So I always like to start with the mission of state parks, because I find a lot of people view state parks through a recreational lens, but the mission of state parks is so much more. It's to provide for the health, inspiration, and education of the people of California by helping to preserve the state's biodiversity, protecting its most valued natural and cultural resources. So the area of the mission that I focus on is that preservation of biological diversity and protection of natural resources. And just, sorry the map is so small, should have made it bigger, but for a little geographic context, because there were multiple land management agencies presenting, these are the state parks in Marin County. So starting in the northern area of the county, in West Marin, we have Tamales Bay State Park, Marconi, and then Olompali over by Novato. Then moving down to Samuel P. Taylor, and then China Camp State Parks, and down to Mount Tam State Park and Angel Island. So those are the state parks in Marin County. So like everyone else, I was asked to speak about best practices today and compliance. And I think the policies and regulations behind what we do are critical in the discussion of best practices. They are really the framework and guidance for everything we do in our parks and in resource management in state parks. So these are just some of the key regulations and policies that guide our work: the state constitution, multiple state and federal regulations, the California Public Resources Code, which actually forms the statutory law that guides much of the resource management in our state parks. Then specific to state parks, our Department Operations Manual, or DOM as we call it, outlines all of the policies for natural and cultural resource management interpretation. There's a natural resource chapter. And then specific to each park unit, we have general plans. And those are the guiding management plans for the parks. And they're also program EIR documents. And in those general plans, there are guidelines specific to natural resource management and vegetation management. Getting into some specific policy from our DOM, our Department Operations Manual, I think, again, the policy really influences best practices. And our overall goal in plant management within state parks statewide is to protect, restore, and maintain native plant populations and naturally occurring plant communities. And we have a large focus on accomplishing this through maintenance or reestablishment of natural processes, because these are dynamic systems. So fire, flooding, and succession. And then we have a specific policy on fuel reduction. And this is somewhat unique to state parks. Our flammable vegetation fuel modification policy states that it's the department's policy to prohibit the construction and maintenance of fire breaks, fuel breaks, and other fuel modification zones on department lands, except in very specific instances. So that is required by state law to clear around structures, that's defensible space. When previous legal commitments have been made, that's often during an acquisition of new park land, or if it is critical to the protection of life or park resources. And for that one, that is where it's very key for us to be partnering, and we do partner with Marin County Fire, CAL FIRE, the fire agencies to determine if we are going to look at a fuel break or fuel modification zone, it has to be very strategic and very critical for firefighter access and safety. Because we also learned in the North Bay fires that fuel breaks don't necessarily stop a wind-driven fire. So they have to be looked at very critically for being regionally strategic for the fire agencies. And then the last one, this is kind of wordy, but park vegetation, 130 feet from non-department habitable structures, so homes, is capable of generating enough heat to ignite those structures. So this is neighbor defensible space. And you can see an example here, China Camp State Park in the top of the map, and then the green line is the park boundary. You can see how some neighborhoods, we don't have quite as many as some of our other partners like Mischon, but some neighborhoods, at least in this region, some neighborhoods come right up to our park boundary, and those neighbors can achieve their defensible space without going into parkland. So specifically to that area of McNair Drive at China Camp State Park, we implemented a vegetation management shaded fuel break project in 2009 in partnership with Marin County Fire and San Rafael Fire. And you can see the photo on the top. There are homes just to the left of that photo, and that's in process, where a lot of the vegetation has been limbed up, shrubs have been thinned out on that slope that leads up to the homes. And then pile burning was done for all of the material. And what I have on the right here, if you go to SequaNet, the online Sequa database, this is what a page for a notice of exemption or a Sequa filing would look like. So in 2009, State Parks filed a Sequa notice of exemption for issuing a right of entry permit to Marin County Fire to do this work. And so this is what's visible on the public SequaNet site, but behind this is a pretty detailed project evaluation form, which is like a Sequa checklist that is prepared. All the resources are assessed. And like Mischon said, a lot of our best management practices, which I'll get to in a minute, are baked into the design of these projects. But issuing the right of entry permit in itself is a discretionary action under Sequa. So the work and the issuance of the permit triggers Sequa review. And then moving to recent, the last couple of years, we don't only issue permits to partners like Marin County Fire. We will also issue permits to neighbors, individual neighbors, or homeowner groups that pool their resources. So this is similar to what Marin County Parks does. But again, those boundary permits for neighbors to do their defensible space are discretionary actions under Sequa and trigger review. So after the 2017 North Bay fires, we were getting a lot of neighbors asking for these permits. So for certain park units, we decided to, instead of whenever a neighbor got a permit, doing Sequa review and they wait 2 months or 3 months for their permit, we actually did park-wide analysis and review for the wildland-urban interface footprint of those parks for issuing these permits. So again, it's a small footprint, the defensible space zone behind the homes, but we now have this notice of exemption for China Camp was filed in 2018. We have this in place, so if a neighbor approaches us and wants to do their defensible space work, we can actually issue them a permit as long as we scope the work and it fits under our Sequa review and includes all the best management practices. We can issue a permit in a week or two, which really helps neighbors achieve their defensible space. And again, has a limited footprint. But this is the class 4 categorical exemption, minor public alterations of land and vegetation. So this is essentially the defensible space work. This is kind of a summary of the work that will allow neighbors to do in their defensible space zone. So removing dead trees and live trees, thinning, removing ladder fuels, cutting grass. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this because it's similar to what other partners have discussed. But again, this is within that defensible space zone of neighbors. And these are our resource management goals and best practices that are as Mischon said, baked into the design of these projects and these permits that we issue. So removing exotic plants and trees unless they're historic, not removing healthy, mature scenic trees, retaining wildlife snags and wildlife logs. Often it's, this is just the minimum of 1 per acre. And often these areas behind homes are smaller than an acre. Retaining special habitat trees, doing seasonal bird breeding season avoidance, surveying for rare species, making sure equipment that comes in is clean and free of dirt, plant material for not transporting pests. And our natural resource staff manage this work. I also have here, develop invasive species maintenance plan for work areas. This is really important in areas where French broom and other invasives are a problem. So some of you have probably seen this article from 2 or 3 weeks ago in the Point Reyes Light, fuel break to be revived in Tomales Bay State Park. So we are partnering with Marin County Fire and some of the neighbors in the Sea Haven community to reestablish a shaded fuel break that was actually installed quite a few years ago. So this work was originally done in the early to mid 2000s. And this is, again, a printout from Sequanet. This is the original notice of exemption that was filed in 2003 for the Sea Haven shaded fuel break. And pretty extensive mapping and review were done, CEQA checklist. There was mapping and avoidance and protection of the rare manzanitas and the location of the fuel break. But so this actually, unfortunately, wasn't maintained. This is where, like Mischon, we are learning and improving as well. So we actually are going to reestablish this shaded fuel break only on state park land. So it's about 4 acres or so of work on state park land. So we just recently did a updated CEQA review and filed a new updated notice of exemption in May. And that also covered issuance of boundary permits. Although there aren't that many neighbors, once the Sea Haven boundary is addressed, there aren't that many neighbors. So that's why I said limited there. Because again, these are only neighbors that live close enough to our park boundary to need to do defensible space in the park.
2-minute warning, Cyndy.
Okay, thank you. So then I would also like to, I'm almost done actually, give you a glimpse of something to come. Focused mostly on the boundary, defensible space work, how we work with neighbors to help them achieve their defensible space. But we actually have pretty extensive vegetation work and habitat restoration work that we do in the backcountry areas of our parks. And in Tomales Bay State Park, we've known for years that we have issues with the health and sustainability of the Bishop Pine Forest. There are issues with drought, disease, and probably primarily a lack of a natural fire regime, which the Bishop Pines need to regenerate. So we recently hired a local forester to do a forest inventory, a detailed forest inventory in the park, which gives us the baseline data to then develop prescriptions and implement forest health and forest management work in that park. So we have not yet done the compliance for this because this is going to be a much larger footprint than what I was talking about with the boundary permits. And we don't have the detailed prescriptions yet, but we're working on it and hope to be implementing some forest health work in the Bishop Pine Forest of Tomales Bay soon, in the next couple of years. So with that, I'll wrap up and say Thank you. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Cyndy, so much. And Jill Templeton has a question about, she'd like you to describe what is a special habitat tree from your presentation.
Okay, let's see. So I had a photo in there of an acorn granary tree. That's just one example. We actually go out and survey and look for trees with large nest cavities or broken tops or evidence of acorn granary activity, any number of special features that make them really high quality habitat features that are less common on the landscape. It's always a case-by-case individual assessment at the location, but those are them.
Great, and if anyone else has a question, just unmute yourself real quick or type it in there. Otherwise, that pretty much covers it. I guess that's it. Thank you so much, Cyndy. Mike, you want to pick it up?
I see one more question.
The funding source for such projects. There you go.
Yeah, so we're working on the funding source for the Bishop Pine Forest Management. We do not have everything there that we need for that yet. For our boundary vegetation permits for neighbors, we issue the permit and they do that work at their own expense. So we don't use state park funding, taxpayer dollars for neighbors' defensible space. And then our fuel break footprints are actually, like I said in the beginning, very, very limited. So it's a mix of yes and no on the funding question.
Gotcha. And Dave Long is asking about what treatments you are proposing for the Bishop Pine project. Does it include fire? And what about Bolinas manzanita?
Yeah, so it will, for the manzanita, it would include mapping and protection of special status species, including the rare manzanita. The recommendations include potential fire, potential mechanical treatment, could be fire in the form of pile burning combined with mechanical treatment. There's a range of options, and we will have, our next step is getting specific prescriptions for specific locations developed.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we're doing really good on time. Mike, back to you.
Unmute. Cyndy, great presentation. Thank you so much. Coming all the way down here from Sonoma County. Oh, you're still there. Okay, next up we have Shannon Johnson. I've not met Shannon before, but she's working on a special project here in Marin for Marin County Fire. Shannon's a forester with CAL FIRE, and she's actually using the new CAL Veg Treatment Program EIR to assess a project in Fairfax. So Shannon, take it away.
Hello, I'm gonna, excuse me, mainly go through the process and explain the new VTP EIRs and then how we're gonna be utilizing it and for the Oak Manor VTP. So give me a minute while I bring up my presentation. All right, so the California Vegetation Treatment Program, the CAL VTP, is relatively new. It was approved by the Board of Forestry in January of 2020. So previously, what CAL FIRE would do for fuels reduction projects is what we had was our chaparral management program, and that was based on an EIR from 1981. So in order for us to use this with cooperating landowners, it was generally in chaparral, and if we want to utilize it in grassland or timber, we always had to have a supplemental document attached to it. So another negative declaration, an EIR, sometimes timber harvest plans to be able to do work in those other areas. And then we also weren't able to utilize it on state parks or other federal lands. And it was just a document that CAL FIRE could only use with cooperating landowners. So this new CAL VTP, which was again approved by the Board of Forestry this January, can actually be utilized by anyone who's signed on to participate. That's within what we call the treatable landscape, which was the state responsibility area. And that was analyzed for all of California, and it's pretty much all fuel types. So they kind of break them down into 3 broad categories of brush, grass, and tree. So again, this can be used by anyone, not just CAL FIRE. So that's one of the benefits of it. So the purpose of the CAL VTP, I'm gonna just bear with me as I read these, is gonna serve as a management tool to reduce risks from high vegetation fuel loads, increase the pace and scale of fuel reduction to achieve our governor's goals of 500,000 acres per year, increase the use of prescribed burning as a vegetation treatment tool, manage forests and working lands to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by reducing large catastrophic fires, and to improve the ecosystem health by increasing fire on the landscape. So for CAL FIRE, there's a lot that goes into our vegetation. Well, we used to call them vegetation management program, but this is also our vegetation treatment program. It's more than just a PSA. There's, for the Board of Forestry and the CAL VTP, there's proposed project reporting, completed project reporting, approval reporting and completed reporting. We also have a project plan and prescription, which goes into like how we're going to burn and the different treatments and environmental aspects, cultural and things like that. There's also, because this is an agreement between us and a landowner, there's a cost apportionment portion to it. So, but with the passing of Senate Bill 901, we don't have to have landowners contribute anymore, but they can if they would like to. So, and then the big part of it, this is for the CAL VTP, is the project specific analysis, what we call the PSA, and the environmental checklist. There's also standard project requirements, which are SPRs, and then mitigation measures associated with different impacts. We also have the contract, which is our RM75. If there's burning, we'll have a smoke management plan and a public information plan. And then once the project is completed, we have reporting for it. So when CAL FIRE is looking at working with a landowner to put a fuel reduction project on the landscape, we always want to meet with them in person and tour the property, make sure that it actually is feasible and has a benefit to the community and the landowner. So one of the big things with the VTP, like I said, is it within that treatable landscape or SRA? And if it's not within SRA, you can still use the VTP, but you just have to have, so let's say it's a part of a local responsibility area, any of that portion of the project will need a supplemental environmental document with it. The only one we don't work with is on federal lands because that's NEPA instead of CEQA. So once we decide that the project is feasible, we'll have it posted to the Board of Forestry's website, which is a part of the VTP process, just to say, hey, we're proposing to put a project here. Here's an estimate of the acreage. We think there's 3 treatment types that are associated with the CAL VTP, what's called a WUI, wildland urban interface fuel reduction, a fuel break, and an ecological restoration. And then, so we'll say what of those 3 categories it falls into, and then there are 6 different treatment activities that can be proposed under the VTP. And so those are prescribed fire as in a controlled burn, and then also prescribed fire for pile burning that's distinguished between in this VTP. And then whether or not it's mechanical treatments, manual treatments, herbivory, prescribed herbivory, or herbicide. And there'll be estimates for those different acreages and what you think you're going to do for each one. So once we have that posted to the Board of Forestry's website, we always will have maps within our project that have, you know, the parcels, zoning. We'll talk to the landowners about any of the knowledge that they have in the area for biological or cultural resources, because they'll, we have some landowners that have been there for centuries and they might know, oh yeah, there's an old mill site here, or hey, like the deer really enjoy fawning in this area, so we want to keep this area untreated to protect it for them. We'll also reach out to other agencies to get their input. So the big one that we work with a lot is the Department of Fish and Wildlife. We'll do our California Natural Diversity Database search and then provide information to them on what we have found. Find out if there's anything, you know, that special habitats that need to be retained, any rare threatened plants that are there. The big thing with the Cal VTP is that there's what's called an ecoregion. So the state is broken up into really large chunks, and within those ecoregions, there's specific habitat information on all the different habitats that could potentially be there, any special concerns, whether or not there are habitat conservation plans within those large ecoregions. And what the goal is that because for CNDDB search, it's just a presence search. It's not something that if you haven't seen it, it doesn't mean it's not there. So they want to make sure that all habitats and plants and animals have been assessed. So specifically for this Oak Manor project, the ecoregion is the North Coast region, and that one goes from Crescent City all the way down to Marin. So it's a very large area, but it makes sure that you analyze all of those potential habitats. We'll also reach out to any of our local air pollution control districts, so that if we are going to be doing any burns, that we make sure that any permits are acquired or any fees are assessed. We'll also reach out to water quality, California Geological Survey, if we do have unstable areas that we think might need to be addressed within the project, and the Coastal Commission as well for any permits that need to be applied for. So as I said, there's ecoregions is a big thing within the VTP. And so for this one, again, it covers Crescent City down to Marin. And there's an actual table within the EIR itself that breaks down, not only, it has a table specific to plants, but then also for wildlife as well. And there are multiple pages, very tiny font. So once we've done an analysis of the area and worked with the landowners, we want to make sure that we develop the project based on, you know, taking in all of this pertinent information, so that it's beneficial not only for the landowner, but for the administering unit, and then also for the environment as well. So once it's all developed, we'll have our landowners sign our work agreement, which is what we call our RM75. We have different levels of review. So once it goes from our administrating unit, our region, we'll look at it. CAL FIRE is broken into a northern and southern region. And then it'll be transferred to our Sacramento office for final review and approval. And then once it's approved, it'll be the specific project, the project-specific analysis, and the SPRs and mitigation measures will actually be posted to the Board of Forestry's website for the public to see. And then once it's completed, it'll be tracked on that Board of Forestry's website as well. So this is just our project, proposed project reporting. So this is the information that we provide to the Board of Forestry. Again, at least 15 days prior to approval, but we try to encourage people to get it out there as soon as possible. It's just, like I said, it's a point on the map, how big the project is and what type of activities are associated with it. And there's a link there to the Board of Forestry's website, just so you can visually see where the projects are. And this is where you would find it on the Board of Forestry's website and the project information that would be proposed. So I'm going to just quickly go through the project specific analysis and checklist. So this is the one that's specific for CAL FIRE. There is a hypothetical checklist that we are encouraging other entities to utilize on the Board of Forestry's website. This is just our version of it. So the first part of the checklist is just that basic project information. You know, who is the lead agency, where it's located, what you're proposing to do, the treatment types that you have, you know, what activities there are, again, the fuel types, whether or not it's within the whole treatable landscape of the VTP, you know, consultation that you did for other agencies and whose approval is required, and then, you know, also for the Native Americans. So the PSA also dives into treatment maintenance. So for our contracts, they're only good for 10 years. So if the landowner would like to continue working with us, we have to do a whole nother project specific analysis in order to continue working on that property. The CAL VTP is unique compared to other CEQA documents. It actually requires that after 10 years that another PSA has to be done to address any potential new, you know, impacts that could occur. So once you do all of your analysis, you'll come to a determination of whether or not your project is completely within the scope of the CAL VTP, or if you need to have other additional supporting documentation. And this will actually be done after you go into the checklist itself, which here is an example of our checklist. So there are 16 impacts that are analyzed within the CAL VTP. And so this is just an example of one for aesthetics and visual resources. This impact is just a summary of the whole impact. When you're doing your analysis, you'll actually have to have the VTP open because the whole analysis itself is multiple pages in order for you to come to a proper conclusion. So the first part of it is actually the whole CAL VTP's assessment on this potential impact and where they fall on its significance. The second part, where it says project specific, is whether or not your project is actually, your treatment applies to that impact, excuse me, and then what your significance is. If you, so for this one, the first one, for impact AES1 for aesthetics, it says that the impact is actually going to be less than significant. So if your, so this one is specific for if your treatment is I believe it's 6 months or less for aesthetics, if you're going to have like fuel reduction and you think it'll be, I'm trying to think, like longer than 6 months that you'll have like a visual impact on that area, you would say that your impact would actually be potentially significant.
Shannon, 2 minutes.
Okay, I'm getting close. So if your impacts are greater than what's proposed in the EIR, then you have to address, you would have to have an additional documentation. So it also goes into the specific project requirements, and these are things whether or not you would say they're applicable to the project, and if they are, who would be implementing them, and then also the mitigation and measures associated for each one. And so the full language with that is then attached to the document so that you can see these are the specific project requirements that I'm going to implement for this plan. So I'm going to scroll down. So the Oak Manor VTP. So when the VTP was developed, CAL VTP was in the process of being developed. We, in our northern region, came up with 5 projects. And this is one of them, which we've asked Marin to let us be the lead in to test out the VTP. It's currently in the planning phases. It's already been proposed. It's about 150 acres, and it has, I believe, 5 or 6 landowners that we're going to be working with. And what we're going to be doing is about a ridgetop fuel reduction, about 200 feet on each side of the ridges, and then 30 feet on the roads. And they'll be removing Doug fir, Monterey pine, mulching dead and down to try and maintain the existing grasslands and the shaded oak understory. There is going to be the potential to have herbivory, goats within there, and then also pile burning within it. So it's still in the planning phases. We had 2 people in our northern region that were working on the projects, and now we're just cut down to 1 because I moved into a different position. But we are hoping to have it developed before the end of the year. So that's a quick summary. Any questions? I'm sure there are a lot.
Great, wonderful presentation, Shannon. Jill has a good question. Are Cal VTPs integrated with timber harvest plans?
No, they are not. So the Cal VTP cannot be utilized to commercially harvest timber. So you can do like a dead and down, or you can remove dead trees or some hazard trees, but you can't commercially log with the VTP.
Wonderful. I don't see any other questions. If anyone has a question, just pop up real quick here. Otherwise, Shannon, thank you so much. And Mike, I will pass it back to you at this point.
Okay, thank you, Shannon. Great presentation. That probably is the fastest pass through that document ever. It's a meaty subject, and there's a lot of folks here that are actually studying it. So it was a great overview. Thank you for that. And we're looking forward to see how the project in Sleepy Hollow moves forward. Okay, kind of a different, our next contestants, Carolyn Christman and Danny Franco from Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy. They're working on a one-TAM funded project for all the one-TAM partners. And it's really kind of a broader look at vegetation management in a county that could be a really good model for moving forward through all the parklands. That's part of the one-TAM sphere. So take it away.
Okay, thanks, Mike. And thank you everyone for having us here today. As Mike said, this is a little bit different than the other work we've been talking about. We're going to be providing an overview of the goals and the process for developing Marin Regional Forest Health Strategy, with some references to BMPs and treatments and how they fit into the strategy, but that's not really what we'll be focused on. But I will say that we have a lot of similar concepts that we've been discussing with the other agencies, and we are building on work and lessons learned from all of the public land managers you presented earlier, and those are the one-TAM agencies, so we're all working together on this. And also, Sharon Farrell is included in this slide, but unfortunately she couldn't be here today, so it's just going to be Danny and I talking. So the Marin Regional Forest Health Strategy is a one-TAM effort to develop a coordinated regional approach to forest management in Marin. Don't go on yet, Danny. So as we've talked about, disease, drought, and a warming climate are having significant impacts to forests and also increasing the risk of wildfire. With these conditions, there's a growing realization that more active forest management is needed in some locations, and that a coordinated effort will be the most efficient and successful path forward. So the purpose of this project is to develop a regional multi-benefit strategy for Marin County's public lands. The strategy aims to assess forest health on a landscape scale, prioritize future management areas, and describe treatment methods and best management practices that can be used to promote climate resiliency, ecosystem protection, and wildfire mitigation goals. Next slide. So the one-TAM collaborative brings together public land managers to develop a coordinated set of goals, projects, and programs to improve the health of Mount Tam. I think most people here today are familiar with one-TAM, so we won't talk more about that, but I just wanted to note that the Marin Forest Health Strategy actually has a wider geography than most one-TAM projects, and it's looking at all the publicly publicly managed lands in Marin County that are forested. So we wanted to just talk a little bit about the peak health report. This is one of the first things that OneTAM worked on together. So OneTAM wanted to understand and document the current health of Mount Tam and the surrounding areas. There's a general assumption that Mount Tam's ecosystems were doing well and continuing to provide ecosystem services that we value, but it wasn't based on a thorough assessment of available information. So the 2016 peak health report gathered together existing data and worked with internal and external experts to develop metrics for assessing health based on that data. In addition, this report noted a number of places where there were data gaps and existing data was not sufficient to draw firm conclusions. So this is important just because we are building off of the peak health report in our approach to developing the forest health strategy. And also, one of the big data gaps that the peak health report identified was around vegetation, and this led to the development of the Marin fine-scale vegetation map project, which Danny's going to give a lot more information about a little bit later on. So just wanted to note that for the forest health strategy, we are drawing on the peak health report approach and integrating metrics that were developed during this process. And I also wanted to note that OneTAM staff are working on an update to peak health, and they'll be using metrics that we developed for the forest health strategy. We'll be drawing on information from them, so there's all of these different planning processes are working together. So this actually, the work that we're doing is funded through grants. So right now, as we've all been talking about, there's a statewide focus on forest health, carbon sequestration, climate change, and wildfire mitigation, and there's a lot of state funding being provided for local and regional groups to address these challenges and build local capacity. For this project, OneTAM is actually a sub-grantee to the State Coastal Conservancy, who is funded by the California Natural Resources Agency through the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program. So we heard a little bit from the Novato Fire Agency earlier, and there's probably some questions about how fire agencies and public lands are working together. In terms of the forest health strategy, we are really focused on wildlands and protecting and restoring ecosystems in the wildlands and promoting multi-benefit projects to reduce fuels. I think there will be some overlap with the work that the fire agencies are doing, but our main geographical areas of focus are a little bit different. But as part of the strategy, we will be developing preferred treatment methods and BMPs that we'll be sharing, which we can hope can be used more broadly by everyone doing forest management in Marin. And those treatment options and BMPs will be based on the methods used successfully by Marin public land managers, which we've heard so much about earlier today. Okay, so the goals of the forest health strategy. We have an overarching goal to improve forest health in Marin with focused management action. So to meet this larger goal, our interim goals are to develop a landscape scale understanding of forest health by describing how forest ecosystem functions and the negative impacts of stressors such as forest pathogens, climate change factors like drought and reduced fog harvest, and the spread of non-native invasive species impact forest health. Then, keeping in mind limited time and resources, identifying priority work areas for active management. Next, develop detailed descriptions of forest management treatment approaches and a process for identifying the best treatment approach for a particular site based on forest type, sensitive resources, access, and other factors specific to that site. So treatment approaches, which we've heard about today, include things like invasive species removal, mechanical removal of sudden oak death impacted vegetation, revegetation, and lots of other methods. Next, we intend to provide education about the value of our forests and highlight the linkages between forests and communities. I think most people know forests provide beauty and recreation, but they also are critical for habitat and clean air and water. So in our education and our outreach, we want to underscore the importance of investing in forested lands. And finally, We will identify potential forest health projects and outline the pathways to implementation, focusing on strategies to complete compliance and obtain funding. Now, some of the key components of the forest health strategy are to complete a county-wide forest health assessment for all forested public lands, and we're looking at 5 key forest types. Three of those forest types were in the 2016 Peak Health Report, and then we're adding 2 more types. So our forest types are coast redwood, open canopy oak woodland, Sargent cypress, bishop pine, and Douglas fir. Then, using new foundational data from the Marin fine-scale veg map, we'll identify priority treatment areas which are impacted by forest health stressors and which could benefit most from active treatment. We'll define multi-benefit treatment approaches and related VMPs leading to improvements in forest health across a variety of health indicators. And like I mentioned before, that will be based on all of the experience that Marin public land managers already have using those different treatment approaches and related and those BMPs. So we'll have a lot of lesson learned to work from there. Then we'll study and monitor active management areas to evaluate different treatments and BMPs to determine which are most effective in enhancing forest health and protecting sensitive resources. And finally, developing education materials and actively engaging the Marin community. So next, just a look at what the forest health assessment process could look like. So we've laid out kind of a linear approach here, but we'll actually be continuing back to the early steps and refining our understanding based on new data and discussion as we move along. So it won't be quite as linear as this. But we're starting with building conceptual models for each of the 5 target forest types to help understand the ecological function and complex interactions of each forest ecosystem. Then, working with one-TAM staff and external technical experts to identify health indicators and threats that impact forest health, and revising the conceptual models to incorporate those health indicators. Yeah, and then working with those experts again and building from the conceptual model, we will determine metrics we can use to quantify and geospatially locate forest health attributes and threats on the landscape. Metrics could include, for example, forest structural complexity, tree mortality, presence and proximity of invasive species, and many other things. So we're building on metrics that were included in Peak Health, as well as metrics which have been used and documented in similar forest health assessment processes in other parts of California and across the West. Then we'll use those metrics to analyze newly available data from the Marin Fine-Scale Veg Map project, as well as existing data from one-TAM agencies' natural resource management programs. And then we'll be using, I just wanted to also mention, we'll be using analysis methods which have been vetted by other researchers and land managers, so we're not going to be making up the analysis process from scratch. And then once we've analyzed forest health data based on the selected metrics, we'll locate priority treatment areas based on the health and feasibility, based on health, and then also on feasibility, such as things like how easy is it to access the site, how easy is it to get pieces of equipment in there, what kinds of sensitive resources are nearby. And finally, once potential project areas are identified, we'll integrate the assessment into the strategy and look at the next steps to implement the project, such as what treatments are best to meet the project goals, what BMPs should be used, what's the compliance and permitting pathway, and what are the best options for funding, and then what monitoring and maintenance is needed for long-term success. And so now we'll look at a conceptual model. And we don't expect everyone to be able to, to read everything in the box, but we just wanted to show what a conceptual model is. So we've been talking about conceptual models. On this slide is an example of a conceptual model for coast redwood. So the conceptual model is a foundational tool we're using to describe forest health and to map out the interconnected pathways of ecosystem function. So it's a kind of a simplification, but it allows us to look at a forest type and see the connections between ecological benefits or services, so those are shown on the far right in blue, and then healthy attributes of the target forest type to the left in gray. And then next, continuing to the left, we mapped out the threats, which are shown in pink, and contributing factors in orange. So those are negatively impacting the healthy attributes. And finally, we identify possible interventions or treatments, shown here in yellow, to reduce or mitigate the threat to forest health. So this is really just a tool to be able to look at these pieces and see how they fit together. And then next we'll show a simpler one part of a conceptual model. So here we've pulled out one pathway of the conceptual model to show how it connects from ecosystem services through to treatment. So on the right, we have biodiversity as our ecosystem service, and it's linked to the forest health attribute of native species diversity. And then the direct threat to native species diversity in this path is non-native invasive species and forest pathogens. And the contributing factor here is a kind of a package of vectors: roads and trails, equipment, which can carry soil and seeds on tires and treads, and then fuel breaks. So knowing that these are vectors to move invasives, we can identify a few interventions to reduce the impact, such as VMPs for good hygiene, early detection, rapid response programs to find invasive infestations and treat them early on, and ongoing invasive species management. So in the larger conceptual model that we looked at first, this pathway is tied into other pathways that shows a more complex picture. But the conceptual model tool is really useful because it allows us to focus on one pathway at a time to identify the health attributes and threats, and it simplifies a very complex system to help identify treatments that can be used individually or together to improve forest health. So I've mentioned a few times that there are internal and external experts involved in this process. First, the One-TAM Forest Health Working Group is leading this effort, and that's composed of natural resource and conservation staff from the One-TAM agencies and is the core team developing the strategy. And a number of people that are on that team are also on this call today and have presented about their agency's efforts. And then second, we are working with a group of outside technical experts with extensive experience in forest and fire ecology, geospatial modeling, and planning and implementing large-scale forest management projects. And those technical experts are providing guidance and review for each component of the strategy. So both of those groups are feeding into the One-TAM Forest Health strategy. And now I will pass it over to Danny to finish up.
Go fast, Danny.
Sorry.
Can't hear you, Danny.
Danny, you're muted. You need to somehow unmute yourself there on your phone. There you go.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, and I said I was going to go quick too.
We'll give you
I can move through these quickly, Mike. We just wanted to give you a bit more information on what that foundational data is that we're using to do the quantitative analysis part of our forest health assessment. So Caroline mentioned that the metrics we're using, some of them were identified in the 2016 Peak Health Report. We'll also be using the countywide fine-scale veg map that's in development, as well as new investments that the county partners have made in both Lidar and imagery for the whole of Marin County. So what does all that mean? Let me show you. So this is an example of the fine-scale vegetation map. This is in development. So where this is a life form map that really only shows about these 20 classes or so of different vegetation land covers, the fine-scale vegetation map will have 80 to 100 classes. So this really helps us understand the distribution of the forests and forest types across the landscape, which is critical to being able to make a quantitative assessment of their health and condition. Distribution is first. So here's an example of aerial imagery. We're all very familiar with that. I think if you look at Google Maps and things like this, a great aerial view of Mount Tamalpais. Foundational data that we use to, again, understand the distribution of the resources across the landscape. We also use Lidar. What is Lidar? Lidar is remote sense topographic information. So where a camera is taking an aerial photo of the visible spectrum of light, this product actually gives us a 3D model of the Earth's surface. So we're probably all familiar with seeing things like this. It's basically a topographic map of the Earth's surface, and this is built from Lidar data. So it's a very powerful tool that we can use to better understand the distribution of the resources across the landscape, quite literally, the lay of the land. This is an example of how we might intersect the fine-scale vegetation map with Lidar data and metrics from our forest health metrics from peak health and from our work with technical experts. This is just a draft, just meant to be an example, but here we're showing oak woodlands that could be at risk to being converted to Doug fir because of the absence of a natural fire regime. So here we have a combination of foundational data sets like the fine scale veg map, the Lidar data, and the aerial imagery to be able to map out for resource managers where they might have oak woodlands that are either at risk of converting or in the process of converting to Doug fir. Last slide. This is just the timeline of where we're at. We are really in these first two boxes up here, slowly making our way down the ladder here to integrating our geospatial data. Our final strategy document isn't due to the State Coastal Conservancy until winter 2021-2022. So we're just really getting started, but are pretty pleased with the progress we've made so far. And with that, we'll take any questions that you may have.
Okay, let's see. We are starting with Belle. How do you integrate climate change factors into the conceptual model?
That's a great question, Belle, one that we're still working to figure out. Climate change affects almost everything, but we're trying to tease out some of the pieces, such as how it affects moisture availability and how that affects pathogens. I think we realize that we really have to look kind of at what does climate change mean more specifically on the landscape. We can't take it as a whole and actually do anything really focused based on that. But it's a great question and one we're still kind of grappling with. So if you have ideas.
Very good. And then Jim Casper, can Lidar be used to identify understory items like campsites, for example?
I'll take that one, Larry, but I want to go back to Jim's actually first question there, which is, does the assessment apply to currently existing forest type locations and or will it be revisited over time? Because I think that really fits into Belle's question, which is, what's the impact of climate change, or, more broadly, how are these forests changing over time? And what we're really seeking to do is to develop a strategy that establishes some baseline conditions out there for the forests on the landscape, so we can start to ask these questions about how are the forests changing? How does a warming climate impact the forest? The distribution of the forest. Are they expanding? Are they contracting? Which forest types are moving? Which ones aren't? Which ones are suffering, and in what ways? So this is one snapshot in time. This forest health strategy that we're doing now is based on the foundational data that we have that is like a timestamp for our forests, but we're absolutely planning that people are going to follow up on this work in order to be able to better answer questions like what Belle's asking, which is, well, how does climate change factor in? And we'd like to know the answer to that too. And so we're sort of structuring the strategy in a way that will allow us to repeat the analysis so that we can better answer that question. And then I'll take Jim's question, can LiDAR be used to identify understory items like campsites? It really depends, Jim, on a number of things like the quality of the LiDAR or the density of the overstory. In general, you can pick out changes on the landscape if they're large enough in scale and there's actually some level of disturbance to the topography, right? You can kind of detect some anthropogenic things, but an encampment like a tent, I don't really think that that's a reliable use of remote sense data, unfortunately. But if campsites were more established or they were manipulating the soil at a scale that would be significant, then it's definitely something that we may be able to use LiDAR to detect.
Fantastic. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Danny. Mike, back to you.
We got one more from Bill Carney.
Oh, there you go. Will mapping include carbon sequestration, existing and potential, for each veg type and an aggregate?
That's another great question, Bill. So what LiDAR and the fine scale vegetation map do is they get you one step closer to having a better, a more detailed understanding of the carbon sequestration that's happening out there in the landscape, but it takes more work to get from fine scale veg map and Lidar and imagery to an above ground carbon and biomass map. This is something that was done in Sonoma County, and this is something that